Welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership podcast, where I get to interview global leaders and we get to soak up their wisdom and perspective on all things life and leadership. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Robbie Campo. Robbie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
I am going to touch on your bio so people know a little bit more about you if they haven't come across you before, and then we will jump into our conversation. So, Robbie Campo is the CEO of Emergency Services and State Super, a profit to member fund serving Victorian emergency services and state employees. ESS Super has 125,000 members and around 38 billion in defined benefits and accumulation assets. She's worked as an executive in the superannuation industry for over 2 decades and is passionate about the fundamental purpose of superannuation to maximise the retirement outcomes of Australians and ensure that hard-earned contributions made throughout their working lives create financial security in their post-working years. A key priority for Robbie is to see systemic improvements for women's economic and retirement outcomes and women's equal participation in the superannuation system. Robbie's also a non-executive director and member of the Audit and Risk Committee at Victoria Legal Aid and is the chair of Women in Super. As I said, Robbie, welcome. Let's jump straight in with, who are you as a human being?
So I'm a busy human being when I listen to all of that. Look, I'm someone who's always been very purpose-driven in my approach to my work in particular, but I'd like to think in relation to my life. I am the mother, very proud mother of 2 adult daughters. And also I'm part of that sandwich generation, so still caring for parents who are getting quite old, still independent. But I am someone who cares about the world I live in. I like to work with purpose, but I like to make sure that the working environment I'm in is one in which people are looked after and given the opportunity to thrive. That extends to not just my workplace, but the other organisations that I'm involved in. I'm very lucky to have a really great circle of friends. I'm healthy and do a lot, though, to care for, remaining healthy, especially as I'm getting older.
We might touch on that later. Robbie, I love, you and I connected through an executive that I think really highly of. And it's always lovely for me to get that endorsement of someone. So I can kind of echo that the intent you talked about there about creating that sort of work environment, it's obviously, it's working. Because I heard that. So, well, let's touch on growing up and your career story. And we'll think about the pivots and challenges and all those sorts of things. But you didn't necessarily intend to lead a superannuation scheme, did you?
No, God, no. I so far from what my 18-year-old self was looking forward to. So I studied drama. Like, I actually had thought about law, but auditioned and got into drama school. Did that for 4 years. Then decided that was too speculative a life. And so then went back and studied law, completed law, never really with a passionate desire to work in a law firm. It was really about the impact law could have on improving the lives of others, so very much a socioeconomic perspective. And so not surprisingly, I could have gone and worked for a law firm, but when I finished my degree, I did articles at the ACTU. So went into the union movement and worked in the union movement for about 4 years, including at the Textile Clothing and Footwear Union, which is a union that really represents very large numbers of women and women who work in environments where their bargaining power is low. And it was also an industry that was really in economic decline in terms of its presence in Australia, as most of that work was being sent offshore. But at the end of that, I again had one of those moments where I had the sliding doors and took a role in superannuation. And I have to say, initially, I wasn't sure if it was going to be a permanent shift in career, But pretty soon the promise of superannuation just became one that became captivating for me, which is the opportunity to work in an industry where you're having a big impact on the Australian economy. And I joined superannuation when it was still really a very new industry, while building the capacity for ordinary Australians to have a much improved quality of life in retirement. And, that combination of working for growing organisations that are very innovative and making that economic contribution while also, making a meaningful difference to the lives of millions of Australians was, it's just been an incredible privilege actually to be part of that industry as it grows.
So there's always been a clear sense of purpose. I mean, I'd love to know what drew you to the ACTU at that point in time. How did that sort of come about? And I also want to know how much of your underlying drama skills you call on, throughout your career as well. What a great base.
Yeah, it's funny, because I think probably not enough. Maybe they'll come in handy. So the ACT opportunity came about because one of my lecturers had a connection, had previously worked at the ACTU, and so they ran a traineeship for people who wanted to be advocates. And so I applied and got one of those roles. So it was really, I mean, it's an incredible institution, incredibly smart people work there. Typically, they're people who could have much higher paying jobs, so very purpose driven. Some of the people that I met at that time and who became my mentors while I was, in my first couple of years of working are still my mentors. So really, surrounded by incredible people who have done incredible things with their own lives and careers. I think the other thing about that environment is, the scale of impact is, on the national economy and on the national political scale. And that's something else that I think has always really been a big draw card for me, is having the biggest impact I can and being really drawn to working environments where, you can have a very significant impact beyond what's possible in smaller organisations.
Where do you think that drive came from? No.
Um, I guess it's just something that I've always really liked. I mean, I think because I am someone who cares about leaving the world in a better place, in addressing inequality, they're the kind of things that I'm pretty passionate about. And so those working environments are ones where you get to do that work. Um, I never really would have thought of myself as being someone who'd be drawn to the finance industry. And it took me a while, initially I didn't really see myself as very good with numbers. I was, but, it took me a while for that to, for me to accept that was actually part of my identity. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. Does any of that have anything to do with maths at school?
I was good at maths at school, but I think I'm 56, so I think I probably just missed. There was a bit of a focus on maths, and there were plenty of girls at my school who did maths, but I just was much more passionate about humanities and drama and, politics. So I just couldn't cram enough in. And so maths was the thing I let go of. I really wish I hadn't, but I did. So, but I had to re-embrace that, and it's a really important skill set, and I always encourage younger women to not be shy, and it's a confidence game. When I had my daughters and they were, hitting that age where many girls lose their confidence around maths, I luckily had a couple of women that my daughters looked up to, because it's at an age also where they're less interested in what their mother has to say.
I hear you.
They really said, maths is great, just don't be scared of it, be confident. And both my girls are very math sciencey.
Brilliant. So let's get back into your career then. So you're in the super industry, it's growing fast, it's transforming, there's all sorts of exciting stuff going on. there's a long, I mean, you've had 2 decades, I think you said, in that industry now. At what point did the role of CEO come onto your radar?
So I didn't ever really see myself as being someone who would sit in leadership roles. It was really more because I wanted to have impact, and I could see there was more effective ways for impact to be had or made by being in leadership roles. So it was really through the desire to have impact that I was kind of forced out of my comfort zone to take on leadership roles. So I worked in, a range of different areas, but they weren't really operational. So it was more in communications and legal policy and advocacy and, a long time in brand and marketing areas. I was part of the team who created Compare the Pair, which is about to turn 20 years old,
Wow.
incredibly. But I got to the point where I wanted to lead an organisation. I knew that meant I needed to get more operational experience. It's very hard if you're just kind of in policy, advocacy, communications type roles to actually get to the top of an organisation.
Mm.
And so I deliberately set out to find a role where I would have that opportunity, and I was lucky that one came up. There's that word lucky. But I set out to get that experience. And then when I was in an organisation, I just took every opportunity I could to lean into, the hardest projects,
Yeah.
um, the areas where I'd have the opportunity to learn the most. And there's nothing like doing. It's really the best development opportunity that you can ever have is doing rather than, I'm all for book learning. I'm a big, I have a lot of intellectual curiosity, but there's nothing like doing to
Brilliant.
learn.
Yeah. Did you have a good sponsor along the way? Like, were you active in telling people what you wanted to do, or how did you actually go about that?
No, I think it was probably more I've been in an industry where in the profit to member sector, because of its heritage, it's always had a lot of senior women.
Yep.
And so I had many good role models of women in senior positions who were comfortable to disturb the structural barriers that women often experience in taking on leadership roles. But I also think I had sponsors who could recognise my potential and really pushed me out of my comfort zone
Mm.
in terms of, making sure I was taking on roles where I could learn the skills that would be needed in order to progress. And I did, I did have a few people along the way who said, you should be aspiring to be a CEO, and this was quite a long time before I became a CEO.
Mm. Fantastic. So along the way, did you get any feedback? Like, was there any feedback that was sort of hard to hear, but really helped you grow along the way?
Yeah, well, if you're not hearing feedback that's hard to hear along the way, then you're not listening. Because I think, nobody comes along perfectly developed. Even now, like there's lots of things that you have to continue to be open to learning. And typically the best feedback is the hardest feedback to hear.
Mm.
So, I mean, I would say even just when people started talking about you should be doing this, it was always somewhat of a surprise to me that people would think that that was possible because I didn't see it as being where the direction that I was interested in going in. But I also was someone who was not that comfortable with being in front of a lot of people and talking, even though I had the ideas, I'd often look at other people and think, how are you in a senior role? Like I could do
Yes.
that better than you, but didn't help me when I got on my feet. So it is kind of surprising having a drama background, being really comfortable being on stage and being in roles,
Mm.
but much harder being myself on my feet in front of a few hundred people. So I remember a really important bit of feedback I got was from someone I really looked up to, who was a senior leader and CEO of one of the big funds, who rang me after I'd done a presentation and said, "You're just a terrible presenter, and here's someone you can go and do some work with to, here's a training course that I'd really recommend that will have an impact on your capacity to improve that." So, that was really great advice. So,
What a gift.
yeah, an absolute gift. And, so the course was, can I say?
Yeah, of course
So
you can.
Colin James method, so Erica Bagshaw. So I remember when I rang her and I said, "This is what's been said." And she's like, "How did that go?" So I was like, "Well, I've rung you, haven't I?" So, but I do think their approach is about um, not just the technical skills, but what you have to do in terms of your confidence. So that was when I first came across Amy Cuddy and the fake it till you make it. And
Yes.
that has been, pretty important for me, because it was just, that's kind of one of the things when you don't feel confident, that you just have to recognize that the way you come across is often quite different to the way you're feeling. And, it's just about pushing through that deep sense of discomfort that you have often, and women often have, in being in front of people.
And so for listeners, I think most people will be familiar with Amy Cuddy, but Amy Cuddy talks about power poses. So assuming certain positions and, your body then, I guess, responds differently based on some of that. So are you consciously aware of still kind of doing some of that, or have you been doing this for so long now that it just feels natural now?
Yeah, it now just comes naturally. So there's a rare occasion I do quite a lot of talking, especially with my Women in Super hat on, and I am pretty comfortable. It's got to be something pretty big for me to get nervous.
Yeah.
I think if you get up on stage and don't feel any nerves, then maybe it's time to give it up, because it's important that you're caring enough that, you do feel a bit nervous. But I certainly think the anxiety that I used to experience, and I would have to do breathing and, plant my feet on the ground and be quite deliberate about how I was in my body. And that is a way that helps you get through that stage fright.
Yeah. Do you know, I hear this from so many leaders that I coach as well, they're in the lineup, a succession line for a CEO role. And the part of the role that worries them is having to get up in front of big crowds and talk.
Mm.
It's a
Yeah,
common,
see, now I'm just so comfortable with it. And I was so uncomfortable for a while there.
yeah.
I think it took me a while to um, make being a leader a part of my identity that I was completely comfortable with. So, and I still experience it a bit. You meet someone new and they say, "What do you do?" I still am very unlikely to say, "Oh, well, I'm a CEO,"
Mm.
because I just feel like a wanker.
Do you say?
But I'll say I work for a super fund. If they say, "And what do you do there?" then I'll say, like, it's not that I'm
Yes.
avoidant, but
Yeah.
it's yeah. But I certainly think now I am comfortable. It has become part of my identity, and it takes a while. I think. Well, it takes a while, not for everyone. Some people are, come with that confidence. They
Mm.
have other challenges, I'm sure,
Yeah.
that they need to work through in their leadership journey.
I love that you shared that because I was going to ask you how long it took to get comfortable to talk about your achievements.
Mm.
And maybe that's a different thing. I don't know. Like,
Yeah, I think that's a different thing, because I think that's about your. So, I mean, lacking confidence and being humble are probably two different things. And the leaders that I've looked up to have typically been people who are quite humble.
humble. Yeah.
Um, and I still would like to think that people would describe me as being a humble person, but I used to kind of wear it as almost a matter of pride.
Mm.
And it was at one point someone gave me some feedback and said, if if you're in a leadership role and you're too humble, like, the people who work for you in particular need to hear you talk with pride about what you've achieved, because it's partly theirs as well. So
Yes.
that helped me kind of come to terms with being able to talk about achievements. But, I still think it's also really, um, one of the things about being a CEO and being in a senior leadership role is you do have to be conscious that sometimes people tell you what they think you want them to tell you and what
Yes.
you want to hear.
Yeah.
And so also just, always just checking yourself about not getting too, ahead of yourself in terms of what you're thinking.
Yeah. So when did the opportunity come up to step into the CEO role? Was it sort of a long planned one, or how did that happen?
Yeah, I reckon I was really ready. And I had, I had a shot at being a CEO that wasn't successful before I got this one. A lot of people don't talk about, the times they
Yeah.
haven't got. I don't. And I'd always say, whenever people ask about, should they go for a job, especially when you're at a senior level, you don't get that many chances to practice
Mm.
going for the big senior roles. And I think the times when you're unsuccessful are often the best learning you do, because that capacity to articulate, what kind of leader you are, what your achievements are, what your vision is. There's nothing like doing it in a live situation.
Mm.
So I was really ready by the time this opportunity came up. I heard about the vacancy. I was proactive in chasing down who the recruiter was. Um, and it was just a really good fit for, what they were looking for and what kind of leader I was.
Congratulations, firstly. But then, secondly, what surprised you about the CEO role? Were there any elements that surprised you?
Um, I think you you think about the more senior you get, and you think it just gets easier and easier to have an impact.
Yes.
But the ways that you can have impact as a CEO, and in fact, every time you take a step up, you just have to be conscious about the way that you achieve what you want to achieve.
Mm.
And my general rule is, the more senior you are, the less you should be trying to affect things through direct, having direct impact. So I think it's been about, learning, um, being clear about what needs to be achieved, what I want to achieve, what is important for the organisation to achieve, and then thinking about the best way for that to occur. And there are times where it's harder to have the impact that you want to have just because of the environmental circumstances, change resistance, or, resource constraints, all of the things that you have to contend with on a pretty, on an ongoing basis. But then also you have to really be careful about the times where you have impact beyond, having impact that is more than what you intended to have. And you have to be, I'm very conscious that um, your actions can have an unintended impact. Your actions are being observed, what you
Yeah.
role model has a big impact on the way others feel, the way others behave. So always being conscious of, where you're having not enough impact and where you're having too much impact.
How do you assess that, Robbie? What's your own kind of measure for that?
Well, being present, listening, talking.
Mm.
Um, you've got the more formal mechanisms like we run an engagement survey every 6 months, and looking at what people say in that. Probably
Mm.
less the numeric metrics as the comments. Um, Making sure that you have people around you who are consistent and who have consistent values, who buy into the vision, and who have the courage to tell you if things are not going down well or if they disagree with you. Like, I think that's really, really important.
Mm.
Um, there's perhaps some examples on the world scale stage where we're seeing,
Yeah.
too many yes people around certain leaders. But yeah, I do think being open to hearing where things are not working well and being open to revisiting, is this the right way to do this? Is this even the right objective?
What would you call out, Robbie, as the most challenging phase of your career? Like, is there something that comes up for you that you think about, a moment or whatever that was a challenge you had to overcome?
Um, I think the years when I wanted to be present as a mother and play a very active role in my girls' lives, but also have a career.
Yeah,
I reckon workplaces have got a bit better at accommodating flexibility. And I mean, I always worked in workplaces and worked in roles where there was, always quite good availability of flexibility. I think things have come along and improved, but it wasn't like that was never available to me. But I do think that was really hard. I don't think that's uncommon. Many of
no,
the younger women that I talk to still struggle with that and still struggle with the juggle. Um, Otherwise, I guess it's just when you're at those when I've found it hardest is when I'm at those turning points where I recognise I'm probably ready for change and I'm looking for something more and just finding the right time um, to make a move. I probably always wait a little bit longer than I should,
yeah.
but that probably just says something about me. I like to kind of make decisions, well-informed decisions, and know that I'm really ready before I step out.
Mm. There's a couple of themes of things you've said that I think are connected, and one of them, about being aware of your impact and words and a whole range of different things. And I think you and I both know that can be impacted by how you show up. And you referenced earlier that you invest a lot to stay healthy and those sorts of things. Tell me about that. What does that look like for you? How do you make sure you actually turn up as the best leader you can be?
Well, I do yoga, so I'm an absolute fanatic. That's been I probably did it about the same time I became an executive.
Yeah,
So working in roles where there's a fair amount of stress, there's a fair amount of juggle, there's quite long hours. Um, it's a really good way that I stay fit and flexible, but also it's quite good from a mental health point of view, like really
absolutely.
grounding and calming. Um, I've got really good friends, they don't work my very close friends don't tend to work in the same industry that I work in. They've been my friend I've got a group of friends and we've been friends for a long time and they can be brutally honest. So
Yeah,
they'll definitely tell me if they think I'm, taking a wrong turn anywhere, probably even more than I want to hear sometimes.
good.
But we also have a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Um, Uh, but also just making sure that we do have a working environment where there's a lot of trust, there's a lot of collaboration, we're here to do good work and work towards our purpose, but also have the opportunity to thrive.
yeah,
And I get a lot of enjoyment from that. I get a lot of enjoyment from seeing the people, especially the people who are reporting to me and the, senior leaders that they do have the opportunity to grow and develop. And, I expect a lot from them
mm.
in terms of their showing up for that journey. But I do love it when you see people, you know, hitting their own milestones and developing.
Do you remember when you first stepped into the CEO role? Like, do you remember one of the things I remember, and I had great advice stepping in, but was that you're going to look around and see so many things you want to fix. Do you remember any of that? Like, how did you focus yourself and the team on where you could have an impact?
Yeah, so when I walked in, the organisation had done a really significant transformation that had gone live 3 months before I started. And it's fair to say there were many teething issues. So my first year was really just getting stabilising um, really core functions.
Mm.
So, um, it, I guess it meant really getting, we're operating with, information that wasn't perfect information and still really in a mode that felt a bit like a crisis. Um, but it was also one that I stepped into. And as a leader, I think that's often easier to do than if I'd been there for the whole journey. So that just helped me because I think we just had to prioritise things largely based on risk assessments, where it was having a big impact on staff or members. And it was really only after a year that we could start to step back and think a little bit more strategically. Um, I, there wasn't the space to review and revisit the strategy. It took 2 years before we really had the capacity to do that. I was keen after a year, but the board very wisely said, not yet, it's too soon, you don't have the bandwidth, let's just get things stable. So it was a bit of a blur, but I think, crisis environments are actually ones where it makes it really easy to get people working together, to get people aligned, to be clear about what your purpose is. It's often been my experience when, in a range of different organisations that when you're in crisis mode, your team works in a more cohesive way, then it's really hard to do that achieve that level of cohesion and togetherness when you're operating in a BAU mode. But you can't do it forever. You can't operate on adrenaline. So I think beyond that first year or two, I am someone who tends to struggle with prioritisation. I remember that being feedback given to me when I was in year 7 and I wanted to be, in the play and on the debating team and, doing.
Yeah.
And the teacher saying, I think you just have to pick a couple of things and not try and sign up for everything. So as I've moved into more senior roles, I've had to really focus on getting better at prioritising. That's been feedback that's been given to me by the people who work for me my whole career, like you need to be better at prioritising. So it's still a work in progress, Melissa.
I love that you hear that. That's great.
Yeah.
That's really good.
It's, when you want to, when you want to have impact and you want to achieve outcomes, then, it is even more important that you're not trying to take on too much because then you just end up with spinning wheels and nothing actually being achieved.
Yeah. Can we talk about, I guess there's a couple of things. I mean, there actually are a high degree of female CEOs in the industry that you're in.
Yeah.
And, we can cover all the reasons for that. But I'm interested in, your perspective more broadly on, women in super, female CEOs, opportunities for females in the workforce. It's obviously an area you're passionate about with regards to super in particular, but no doubt more broadly.
Yeah. So I do think that in the super industry and in particular the profit to member part of the sector, there's always been a really strong representation of women at senior levels. And that means when there's more women at senior levels, there's more opportunity for women to become CEO. I mean, I actually think if I think more broadly across the super industry, it's true across the whole superannuation industry. It's very different to other industries. And when I talk to other CEOs and senior leaders who have come up through very different pathways, their experience has been very different. They haven't looked up to strong female role models. They haven't had people who sponsor them. And that certainly makes it much harder. And those structural barriers still are well and truly alive in many industries. So I do think that, the very different makeup and heritage of superannuation has meant that it is possible for there to be a very large number of female CEOs who are having that broader impact across the industry. But there's still many structural barriers, and I think there's realms of research. I think it's really interesting with Gia's latest publications are quite impactful in terms of providing data that really is revealing about the state of play of different industries and making industries and organisations accountable for what they're doing to have an impact on that. So I do think that that's going to be productive. There's also quite a lot going on. The current government has got some quite ambitious plans around gender equality and have been doing a lot that's quite concrete in terms of ensuring that there are different opportunities for women and that the things that are structural barriers to women progressing in the workplace, that they are, being addressed in quite meaningful ways. I mean, even just the advent of more flexible working, which we can thank COVID for, has had a very significant impact in terms of the capacity for women to participate in more paid work, and the more paid work and the different types of roles that women can participate in give rise to further opportunities. And, it's way too slow, but it will over time have an impact in terms of their capacity to step into senior leadership roles.
I always think that the role of CEO is not necessarily on a lot of young female leaders' radar. Maybe more so in super because they're looking up and they're seeing it. But if you had a chance to have a plug for a CEO role, what would your plug be for why it should be on people's radars?
Well, I mean, I would say it's not for everyone.
Yep.
Like, you do have to be comfortable making decisions, making difficult decisions at times, being in front of people. But I think that, if you're someone who likes to lead, if you're someone who has, the capacity to develop a vision, who likes leading teams and leading people or having an impact in terms of the outcomes that you want to achieve, then there's no better opportunity than by being the leader of an organisation, big, small, or otherwise. It is ultimately, the opportunity if you want to lead. The other thing that I haven't touched on is I had the opportunity quite early in my career to start taking on roles as a non-executive director.
Yeah.
It's another pathway in terms of leadership, and a pathway that I think many women have, it really has grown in terms of it being an attractive pathway and a very flexible pathway for women. Again, there's still too few women in, especially, the more serious the organisation, the harder it is for women to break into those non-executive roles. But it is another way where you can, do very interesting work and have an impact. And there are many ways that you can, the pathways and the learning opportunities that enable you to progress, many of those are open to really anyone. I mean, my first opportunities were in, being on the kinder committee and being involved in charities where it was unpaid, but it was the opportunity to really help shape, an organisation and delivery of, whatever it was the charity was seeking to achieve. All the skills that you need, you can learn on a kinder committee at a small scale.
You said to me when you and I first connected that a lot of people say the CEO role is lonely, but you haven't really found it that way. What do you put that down to?
I have lots of strong networks. I think that maybe it's because of the industry I'm in, and there are a lot of other more senior women and they've been very generous with their time. But I think your networks are something that you have to work pretty hard at. So, I'm not someone that goes to a lot of drinks. I like being able to go home to my family on weeknights. But I do spend a lot of time every week having coffees with more senior people, with more junior people. A couple of lunches a week at least will be spent, catching up with someone that I want to keep in contact with, even if it's once a year or once every 6 months. And so that's meant that I've had many different types of people that I can call on to help me work through many different types of issues. So, I won't say that there's never been times where I've felt lonely, but it's not something that I've experienced on a regular basis. And I really put that down to having a very large range of people that I can talk to who are fit to talk about, a whole lot of different topics that I might need
Robbie,
assistance in
a
working through.
last question on that, because that's a fabulous thing to have nurtured through your career. Did you get advice on that? Did that come naturally to you to kind of continue to kind of nurture your network?
No, I think it's just something I've always done. I don't think it was advice. I would describe myself as an introvert, but I like parties and I like strong friendships.
Yeah.
So I think it's just because I like strong friendships and I like keeping in touch with people. And I keep in touch with a lot of people who are, I've worked with them or I've been in more senior roles. So it's not just kind of,
Yeah.
I learn from the people who are beneath me,
Mm,
and
mm,
people that I'm not working with who I guess I'm kind of more in a, I mean, I'd still say they're friends, but they're probably friends who turn to me if they need advice or counsel on
yeah.
things. Um, yeah.
It's fascinating. And the reason I just pause on that for a minute is, a lot of people are very nervous about networking, but they still mistake networking for going and, to sort of maybe superficial level functions to meet extra people. And I think you've given a fantastic example of it's actually building deeper relationships and then
Yeah.
nurturing those over time, introvert or not, is a good way to do that. Robbie, the last question I ask in every interview is what does brave feminine leadership mean to you, and do you think it needs to change?
Well, I'd say I've always been a proud feminist.
Mm.
Um, I've never been frightened to own that as kind of something that's an important part of who I am. I've always worked in areas where at least part of my focus is on thinking about gender equality and how it can be achieved. So if I think about brave feminine leadership, I guess it's that I can be in senior roles and I can also be a very proud feminist and be thinking about the way in which my role can impact on improving outcomes for women. And in doing so, in improving outcomes, more broadly across the economy and society. So if I think about, in my current role, our enterprise agreement does have provisions that allow for parental leave that are quite generous and that make sure that there's opportunity for the primary carer and the secondary carer to spend quite a lot of time with the new member of their family. So, I know Julia Gillard, I once heard her describe it as gender equality is true to label. So it's not about advancing women over men, but there's opportunity for everyone actually. The benefits are ones that should be experienced across our whole community. So yeah, I would say being able to be a senior leader, being able to be a proud feminist, and achieving better outcomes for the organisation and for everyone who works there.
Robbie, thank you so much for joining our conversation. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely my pleasure.